I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what this writing process is going to be like. So immediately I started working on new material a lot more than I usually do. And then in the middle of it, losing Jeff just derailed everything. The one thing I wanted to address, that I had to address, I thought, was, the moody aspect of Slayer, because that generally came from Jeff.
When you think of thrash metal, names like Metallica, Megadeth, and Anthrax come to mind. But at the heart of this brutal, unapologetic genre lies a name that often flies under the radar: Jeff Hanneman. His name, though not as frequently spoken in the mainstream as his bandmates, holds immense weight in the world of metal. Hanneman's influence on the genre is immeasurable, his contributions like blood-soaked fingerprints on the very fabric of thrash. Yet, the man himself was an enigma. Quiet, withdrawn, and intensely focused on his craft, Hanneman's death was as silent as the music he created, leaving a void in metal that can never be filled. The early years, a childhood shaped by shadows. Born on January 31st, 1964, in Oakland, California, Jeff Hanneman's upbringing was far from ordinary. Raised in a working-class family, Hanneman's early years were marked by a complex relationship with his father, a World War II veteran. Unlike other children whose fathers told tales of heroism, Jeff's father's silence spoke volumes. He did not discuss the battles he fought, nor the sacrifices he made. Instead, he brought the war home with him in a way few could understand, a silent burden carried on his shoulders. In a dusty old tin box under the bed, young Jeff would discover a world of relics that spoke of violence, war, and the darkest corners of history. Inside that box, Jeff found Nazi daggers, military medals, photographs, and insignias that told stories of brutality and bloodshed. These artifacts were forbidden for children to touch, but Jeff wasn't like other children. His curiosity led him to open that box, and in doing so, he gazed into the abyss of human cruelty. "I didn't learn history from textbooks. I learned it at home," Jeff once said, reflecting on the profound impact these items had on him. The brutal reminder of war that his father carried with him became a lens through which Jeff would view the world. From an early age, Jeff was a quiet, withdrawn child. He didn't fit in with the typical interests of his peers, sports, games, and simple pleasures. Instead, Jeff found solace in obsession. He didn't just play with toys, he was captivated by war, violence, and the idea of destruction. He drew Nazi symbols, read about bombers, and studied the mechanics of conflict. But it wasn't until Jeff picked up his first guitar that the true nature of his obsession began to take form. The guitar, a lifeline to expression. Jeff didn't pick up the guitar to become a star or to make money. He picked it up because, as he later explained, it was the only way he could escape from the chaos in his mind. No one taught him to play. He learned on his own, by ear, intuitively, and without the guidance of a formal teacher. He didn't care about melody or harmony. His focus was on something darker, something raw. His sound was a reflection of the intensity he felt within himself, a ferocious, guttural expression of everything he couldn't say. The music that resonated with Jeff was far from conventional. While others might have listened to pop or classic rock, Jeff gravitated towards something more visceral. Bands like AC/DC and Judas Priest caught his attention, but it was punk rock that truly spoke to him. The faster, more rebellious, and stripped-down sound of punk matched the turmoil inside him. It was during this time, in the late 1970s, that Jeff discovered a blend of influences, punk, metal, and hardcore, that would define his future work. He wasn't interested in following trends. He wanted to create something that could cut through the noise of mainstream music and reach into the darkest corners of human experience. The birth of Slayer, from garage band to thrash legends. In 1981, Jeff met Kerry King, a guitarist with a similarly abrasive attitude, at a garage band audition in Long Beach, California. They bonded instantly over their shared love for heavy riffs and a disdain for the conventional. Without any grand plans or aspirations for fame, they began to jam together. What started as a simple, unremarkable meeting quickly evolved into something monumental. Within days, they were joined by drummer Dave Lombardo, whose blistering speed on the drums was a perfect match for the intensity of Jeff and Kerry's riffs. Tom Araya, who would become the iconic voice of Slayer, was recruited soon after, and just like that, Slayer was born. There was no grand vision behind Slayer's formation. No manager, no producer, no marketing strategy. It was just 4 outcasts, driven by the need to create music that was loud, fast, and terrifying. We didn't think about money. We didn't think about fame. We just wanted to play the music that made us feel alive and scared the hell out of everyone else, Jeff later explained. From the very beginning, Jeff Hanneman was the band's unspoken musical leader. While Kerry King had the technique, Lombardo the speed, and Araya the vocal prowess, Jeff was the one who poured darkness into every note. His riffs were aggressive and relentless, pushing the boundaries of what metal could be. Slayer wasn't interested in fitting into any existing genre. They were faster than Metallica, more raw than Megadeth, and more dangerous than Anthrax. And a big reason for that was Jeff's refusal to conform to the norms of metal, infusing their music with a spirit of punk and hardcore that made their sound stand out. The breakthrough, Show No Mercy, and the rise of thrash metal. In 1983, Slayer released their debut album, Show No Mercy. The album was raw, aggressive, and far from polished. The band had no major label, no corporate backing, and no fancy studio. They printed the album covers themselves and pressed the records by hand. Tom Araya funded the project with money he made from his nursing job, while Jeff, the driving force behind the music, contributed his relentless riffs. Despite its rough production, Show No Mercy became an underground sensation, sparking the beginning of the thrash metal revolution. The band's reputation grew quickly, fueled by their controversial sound and aggressive lyrics. They played tiny clubs where the crowd demanded faster tempos and more intensity. Slayer delivered. Jeff Hanneman was the quiet force behind the chaos. On stage, he wasn't about flash or showmanship. He stood still, head down, his long hair obscuring his face, letting his guitar do the talking. His riffs were sharp, precise, and explosive. He didn't need to engage with the crowd. His music spoke for itself. But even as Slayer's reputation grew, Jeff remained an enigma. He wasn't interested in the fame or recognition that came with their success. He didn't want to be a rock star. He wanted to make music that would shake people to their core. Music that felt like a violent confrontation. And that's exactly what he did. Rain in Blood, the album that changed thrash metal. In 1986, Slayer entered the studio to record what would become their defining album, Rain in Blood. The album was a brutal, unrelenting assault on the senses. From the first note of Angel of Death, it was clear that Slayer had set a new standard for thrash metal. The song, which Jeff had written, was a chilling recounting of the horrors of the Holocaust, specifically focusing on the atrocities committed by Joseph Mengele, the Nazi physician known as the Angel of Death. Jeff wasn't trying to shock or offend. He was telling the truth, unflinchingly and unapologetically. The reaction to the song and the album was immediate and intense. Slayer was labeled fascist sympathizers, and the media came down hard on them. Columbia Records, who had initially signed the band, distanced themselves, and the album had to be released through Geffen. But despite the controversy, Rain in Blood became a monumental success, propelling Slayer into the upper echelons of thrash metal. Jeff's contribution to the album was monumental. His riffs were faster, sharper, and more violent than ever before. The music was relentless, and the lyrics, though controversial, were undeniably powerful. Rain in Blood was not just an album, it was a statement, a brutal, uncompromising statement that would define the genre for years to come. The Reluctant Icon, Slayer's success, and Jeff's withdrawal. After the success of Rain in Blood, Slayer became one of the most recognized names in metal. They toured the world, played to massive crowds, and became part of the Big Four of thrash, alongside Metallica, Megadeth, and Anthrax. But Jeff Hanneman remained unchanged. While the rest of the band partied and embraced the rock and roll lifestyle, Jeff withdrew. He hated flying, hated hotels, and hated the media. But when he was on stage, guitar in hand, he became a different person, a force of nature that could not be ignored. Jeff didn't make music to be seen. He made it to be heard. He didn't want to be a celebrity. He wanted to create art that would resonate long after the music stopped playing. And that was exactly what he did. The silent end. Jeff Hanneman's tragic passing. In May 2013, the metal world was shaken by the sudden and tragic passing of Jeff Hanneman, Slayer's legendary guitarist. The cause of death was liver failure, brought on by years of health struggles, including complications from a spider bite he had suffered in 2011. This single event had set off a cascade of physical and emotional challenges for Hanneman that he could never fully recover from. Unlike the flamboyant departures often seen in the rock and metal worlds, final tours, loud goodbyes, public tributes, Hanneman's passing was marked by a quietness that was as stark as his personality. There were no grand gestures or farewell performances. He did not go out on stage, playing his guitar with his signature intensity, or even leave a final message to his fans. His death was private, intimate, just as he had always preferred his life to be. Hanneman, the man who had crafted the relentless riffs that helped shape thrash metal and defined Slayer's sound, faded away without fanfare. He had given so much of himself to his music, but in the end, his withdrawal from the world had been just as silent as his entrance. Fans were left to mourn, not just for the loss of an iconic musician, but for the unspoken mystery of who Jeff Hanneman truly was beneath the surface. In his death, there was no closure, only the legacy he left behind, haunting the riffs he once played with ferocity and brilliance. The slow descent of Jeff Hanneman, a legend in decline. As Slayer's popularity soared through the 1980s and 1990s, so did Jeff Hanneman's status as one of metal's most iconic guitarists. His razor-sharp riffs, aggressive solos, and raw, unapologetic sound helped shape the thrash metal genre into something ferocious and unforgettable. Yet, as the band's fame grew, so did the weight of expectations. It wasn't long before Jeff found himself increasingly detached from the world that had once exhilarated him. The endless touring, the pressure to outdo previous successes, and the internal tensions within the band began to wear him down. Though he continued to write, play, and perform, a noticeable shift occurred. The man who once thrived on the adrenaline of live shows started to disappear into the shadows. He still brought fire and fury to the stage, but offstage, the light in his eyes seemed to fade. It wasn't that Jeff had run out of ideas. His creativity remained sharp, but the demands of fame and constant touring were eroding his spirit. Slowly, piece by piece, Jeff began to withdraw. He was a man with an enormous legacy, but that very legacy seemed to have become a suffocating weight on his shoulders. The struggles behind the music. A battle within. As Slayer kept churning out landmark albums, South of Heaven, 1888, Seasons in the Abyss, 1990, and Divine Intervention, 1994, Jeff remained a vital part of the creative process, contributing to the band's iconic sound. But with every new album, the toll became more evident. He began to miss more and more band activities, making fewer public appearances and pulling back from the spotlight. To the public, it seemed like Jeff's usual detached nature, his penchant for being a recluse. What no one realized, however, was the quiet war raging inside him, a war between the persona of a thrash metal icon and the internal conflict gnawing away at his soul. Slayer's world was an ever-expanding machine, constantly moving forward, and Jeff seemed to be slipping further and further away from it. His involvement in the band became more of an obligation than a passion. But his silence wasn't one of defiance. It was the silence of a man overwhelmed by exhaustion, physically, mentally, and emotionally. He began to struggle with the idea that the music that had once defined him now felt like a distant echo of a past life. This wasn't a man who had lost his talent. It was a man who had lost his sense of self within the relentless grind of the rock and roll machine. His identity had become inseparable from Slayer's. Without the band, who was he? Personal life. A retreat into solitude. In his personal life, Jeff had always been a man who kept his distance from the media circus that so many of his peers relished. He didn't play the rock star game. No flashy parties, no magazine covers, no shocking headlines. His world was small, confined mostly to his wife, Catherine, and their home, a space where Jeff could escape the madness of the world. When Slayer wasn't touring, Jeff became a ghost. He would disappear from the radar. No phone calls, no texts, no interactions with bandmates. His only constant companion was Catherine, the woman he had met in 1983 at a small show. The first time they encountered each other, Jeff's introduction was unconventional. During the performance, he grabbed Catherine by the hair and kissed her. It sounds jarring, but in Jeff's world, this was how he started a conversation. Despite the odd beginning, their relationship flourished. Catherine was the one person who understood Jeff's peculiarities, the way he avoided crowds, his inability to express emotions in a typical fashion, and his overwhelming need for solitude. But there was something deeper that Catherine recognized in Jeff, a sense of being lost, a deep loneliness that went beyond the surface-level quirks. She once described him as the strangest man she had ever met, but to her, he was more than just the reclusive rock star. Jeff was someone who had a profound internal struggle, a struggle he couldn't articulate. It was as if he lived two lives, one on the stage, where he was larger than life, and the other in his quiet home, where he was barely visible. The decline. Jeff's struggles with health and loneliness. Jeff's retreat into solitude grew more pronounced over time, particularly after the death of his father in 2008. His father, a man who had shared his passion for military history and Nazi memorabilia, had been a significant influence on Jeff's life. The loss of this figure seemed to set off a chain reaction within Jeff, triggering a period of deep depression that he could not escape. He withdrew even further, drinking more heavily and distancing himself from both his bandmates and the music that had once been his salvation. Catherine noticed the changes in him. Jeff no longer laughed at sitcoms. He stopped talking about music, stopped discussing Slayer, and most painfully, he stopped playing guitar. It was as though the man who had once defined thrash metal no longer recognized himself. And then came the devastating moment when Jeff spoke those words. "My hand. It's not the same anymore." The pain Jeff was experiencing wasn't just physical. It was psychological and emotional. His hands, his instruments of creation, had begun to betray him. Arthritis, a chronic condition that causes severe pain and stiffness in the joints, had set in. The condition made it increasingly difficult for him to play the guitar. And for a guitarist like Jeff, this was more than just a physical limitation. It was an existential crisis. Music had been his language, his way of speaking to the world, and now that language was slipping away from him. A catastrophic injury. The final blow. Just as Jeff seemed to be sinking deeper into despair, another blow came in 2011 that would prove to be the final straw. While soaking in a friend's hot tub, Jeff was bitten by something, possibly a spider or an insect carrying a bacterial infection. Within hours, his arm, his left arm, his fretting hand began to swell, turn red, and bruise. It wasn't just a bite, it was a full-blown infection, one that ravaged his arm and threatened his life. Jeff was rushed to the hospital, where doctors had to put him into a medically induced coma. Multiple surgeries were performed, and his skin was grafted to save his arm. But when he finally woke up, the truth was unavoidable. His hand, the very hand that had written some of metal's most iconic riffs, could no longer function in the same way. The injury wasn't just physical, it was a spiritual collapse. For an artist, losing the ability to create is a devastating blow. And for Jeff, it felt as though the world he had lived for was crumbling around him. He rejected rehabilitation. He refused hope. It was as if Jeff had already given up on himself, unable to reconcile his identity with the broken man staring back at him in the mirror. Catherine watched helplessly as Jeff spiraled further into darkness, his silence growing heavier with each passing day. A quiet death. The end of an era. On May 2nd, 2013, Jeff Hanneman passed away at the age of 49. The cause of death officially listed as liver failure due to years of heavy alcohol consumption. But in truth, Jeff had been dying long before that final moment. He had been quietly retreating from the world for years, and when his body finally gave in, it was in a hospital room, far from the stage lights, far from the throngs of adoring fans. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no final riffs, just a quiet departure, as Jeff had lived his life, silent and unnoticed by most, even as the world screamed his name. Tom Araya, Slayer's frontman, was devastated by the loss. His voice broke when he spoke of Jeff's passing, and Kerry King, his longtime bandmate and close friend, was in shock. They had shared everything, the good times, the bad times, and the long nights spent in the tour bus, watching war films and drinking together. But in the final months, Jeff had stopped calling. He had stopped showing up. He had stopped being the man they once knew. It wasn't until Jeff's death that Slayer realized how much of their heart had been ripped away. The announcement of his death left the metal world reeling. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe, but despite the outpouring of love and respect, a void remained. Slayer would continue without Jeff, but it would never be the same. His absence was like a shadow hanging over the band, a haunting reminder of the quiet genius they had lost. Legacy, the quiet icon. Jeff Hanneman wasn't the fastest guitarist, nor was he the most flamboyant. He didn't crave attention, and he didn't live for the spectacle. But his contribution to music was undeniable. He was the driving force behind some of thrash metal's most defining moments. From Angel of Death to Raining Blood, his riffs were not just songs, they were anthems of aggression, defiance, and darkness. He didn't need to scream to be heard. His guitar did all the talking, and his silence was as powerful as any word he could have said. Without Jeff, Slayer was never quite the same. The songs he had written remained in the set list, but no one could play them like he did. They lacked the rawness, the energy, the instinct that Jeff had poured into them. In his absence, Slayer was left with the task of trying to fill a void that no one could ever fill. As Dave Lombardo, the band's original drummer, said, "When a pillar breaks, sure, you can rebuild, but it's never the same." Jeff's legacy wasn't built on fame, flashy interviews, or viral moments. It was built on music, the kind of music that made people feel the fury of the world, the pain of existence, and the darkness of the human condition. He lived on his own terms, and when he left, he did so quietly, without the fanfare, without the media circus. But his influence is eternal. He was a man who didn't need to be understood. He just needed to be remembered.